In the summer of 1887, Montana's Sweetgrass Valley was a land where the wind carried stories older than the mountains. Nestled in its heart was Sagebrush Hollow Ranch, a patchwork of tawny plains and gnarled cottonwoods that seemed to pulse with quiet defiance. The ranch was famed not for its herds or its weathered stables, but for its wildflowers, vivid swaths of columbine and fireweed that bloomed with a fierceness no drought could tame, as if guarding a secret sown by the crow, who once called this valley home. Yet the ranch's true enigma wasn't in its fields. It was in the two women who lived there, the Langley sisters. As distinct as a prairie blaze and a moonlit frost, Lillian Langley the younger was a spark in human form. Her chestnut hair gleamed like polished mahogany and her laugh clear and infectious, could hush a cattle drive or soften a blacksmith's scowl. At 21, she was Sweetgrass Valley's darling, her beauty a beacon that drew suitors from Helena to Billings. Men doffed their hats when she rode by on her dappled moray. Women sighed over the way her gingham dresses caught the light. Lillian thrived in the warmth of adoration, her smile a gift she gave freely, but her sister Eleanor was a different creature. Older by 3 years, with hazel eyes that seemed to see through to the bone, Eleanor bore a scar across her cheek, a thin, pale line from a tumble off a hayloft at 9. Her dark hair, often tied in a loose braid, framed a face that wasn't dull but lacked Lillian's luster. A faint hitch in her step, the ghost of a childhood fever, gave her movements a careful grace, like she weighed each stride against the earth. Eleanor didn't court attention or praise. She was the one who rose at dawn to repair gates, who knew every colt's temperament, who knelt in the dirt to nurture wildflowers into splendor. The townsfolk didn't shun her, they simply overlooked her, not when Lillian's radiance burned so bright. And Eleanor, with a stillness that belonged to those used to fading into the background, had long accepted it. Their mother, Beatrice Langley, widowed 12 years, ran Sagebrush Hollow with a firm grip and a heart heavy with worry. She cherished Lillian, seeing in her a chance to reclaim her own lost youth, while Eleanor was her quiet anchor, the one who tallied grain stores and haggled with merchants. The ranch held its own, but barely. Debts clung like burrs, and talk of selling the land grew sharper each season. So when a stranger rode into Sweetgrass Valley that June, his gray coat dusted with trail grit, and his gaze hard as slate, the town stirred with anticipation. Gideon Caldwell, a widower from New York, was heir to a railroad fortune, a man whose wealth could turn stones to silver. His arrival at the Valley Summer Fair, with his tailored waistcoat and a voice smooth as bourbon, set hearts racing. Tall, with black hair touched by gray at the edges, Gideon carried a quiet weight, like a man who'd buried more than he'd ever say. Women whispered he'd court Lillian. Men wagered on it, tossing coins over whiskey at the Iron Horse Tavern. Who else but Lillian, the valley's gem, could win a man like that? But the next day, when Gideon rode up the dusty trail to Sagebrush Hollow Ranch, his purpose upended every prediction. He swung down from his horse, his boots stirring the earth, and tipped his hat to Beatrice, who stood on the porch with Lillian at her side, glowing in a dress the color of sage. Eleanor was there too, off to the side, her hands smudged with soil from tending a patch of wildflowers near the corral. Her work apron was streaked with dirt, her braid fraying, but her eyes were calm, studying the stranger with neither hope nor doubt. Gideon's gaze slid past Lillian, past Beatrice's eager smile, and settled on Eleanor. "I'd like to speak with Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice low but resolute, like a river cutting through rock. A stunned hush fell, Lillian's fan stilled, her lips parting in shock. Beatrice's teacup clinked against its saucer, her cough barely hiding her disbelief. Eleanor blinked, her trowel slipping to the ground. "Me?" she asked, her voice soft but steady, as if the words didn't quite fit. Gideon nodded, stepping closer. "If you'll allow me, ma'am." The word ma'am lingered, formal yet warm, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Beatrice rallied, herding them into the parlor, though her eyes flicked between Gideon and her daughters, grasping for reason in his choice. Lillian followed, her smile taut, her boots tapping sharply on the pine floor. Inside, with the scent of cedar and worn leather thick in the air. Gideon sat across from Eleanor, his hat resting on his knee. He spoke with the clarity of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm not here for love, Miss Langley," he said, his fingers tightening briefly on his hat's brim. "I need a partner. Someone who knows this land, who can shoulder its burdens. With me, Sagebrush Hollow needs strength, and so do I. Marry me, and your family will want for nothing." His eyes met hers, dark and unyielding, but beneath the resolve was a shadow sorrow. Perhaps, or a truth he kept locked away. Eleanor didn't flush or falter. She folded her hands, dirt still etched in her palms, and studied him, not as a suitor, but as a riddle. "And what do you gain, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice even despite the pulse hammering in her throat. He hesitated, then said, "A chance to begin again." That evening, as Gideon rode back to town, Lillian's laughter echoed across the porch, sharp and fragile like a mirror about to shatter. Beatrice pulled Eleanor aside in the kitchen, her voice low and urgent. "He's mad to choose you over her, but this could save us," she said, clutching her daughter's arm. "Don't waste it." Eleanor nodded, her face unreadable, and climbed the stairs to her room. By the light of a single oil lamp, she stood before her chipped mirror, the scar on her cheek catching the glow. She wasn't chosen for beauty or charm, but for something Gideon saw when no one else had looked, something he needed, though he wouldn't name it. As the lamp's flame danced, casting shadows across the walls, a question took root in her. Heart, fierce and unrelenting, what wounds is he hiding, and why does he believe I'm the one to heal them? The days following Gideon Caldwell's proposal settled over Sagebrush Hollow like dust after a stampede, quiet, but heavy with unspoken questions. Eleanor Langley moved through her routines with the same steady rhythm, checking the fences at dawn, brushing down the horses, and tending the wildflowers that bloomed defiantly along the creek. But now, her thoughts wandered to the man who'd chosen her. Not for love, but for a partnership she didn't yet fully understand. Gideon visited the ranch often, his black gelding a familiar silhouette against the morning haze. He spoke mostly to Beatrice, discussing cattle prices or the cost of new irrigation ditches, his voice clipped and businesslike. Eleanor watched from a distance through the barn window, from the edge of the porch, expecting little and asking for less. She wasn't one to dream of grand gestures or stolen glances. Yet something about Gideon's presence, the way his eyes lingered on the horizon as if searching for something lost, stirred a quiet curiosity in her. One morning, as the sun painted the valley gold, Eleanor knelt in the wildflower patch, her hands deep in the soil, coaxing a stubborn columbine back to life. Gideon appeared, his shadow falling across her work. "You tend flowers like their kin," he said, his tone caught between surprise and something softer. Eleanor didn't look up, her fingers steady on the roots. "They don't ask for much," she replied. "Just time and care." He crouched beside her, close enough that she caught the scent of leather and cedar on his coat. For a moment he watched her work in silence, his hands resting on his knees. "Not many see value in what's quiet," he said finally. Eleanor met his gaze, her hazel eyes unflinching. "Quiet things endure." He didn't respond, but the faintest curve touched his lips before he stood and walked away, leaving her with the echo of his words. That evening in the ranch's dining room, Lillian's laughter filled the air, bright but edged with something sharp. She leaned toward Gideon, her chestnut curls catching the lamplight, and spoke of the upcoming town dance with a smile that invited admiration. "You'll come, won't you, Mr. Caldwell?" she asked, her voice honey-sweet. Gideon nodded politely, his attention drifting to Eleanor, who sat quietly, slicing her bread with precision. "And you, Miss Langley?" he asked. Lillian's smile flickered, but Eleanor only shrugged. "Dances aren't my place," she said, her voice even. Beatrice shot her a look, but Gideon's eyes held Eleanor's for a moment longer than necessary, a question unspoken between them. The next day, Eleanor found a small parcel on the porch swing where she often read in the evenings, a leather-bound journal, its pages blank but for a single line in Gideon's neat script, for thoughts too quiet to be spoken. No signature, no explanation. She traced the words, her heart quickening, not with romance but with a strange recognition. He'd noticed her habit of scribbling notes in the margins of old ledgers, her way of capturing fleeting ideas. She tucked the journal under her arm, saying nothing, but that night she wrote her first entry, a sketch of the wildflowers, their petals curling like secrets. Lillian, however, wasn't one to let attention slip. At supper a few nights later, she cornered Gideon as he stepped onto the porch to watch the sunset. Her voice was low, persuasive, carried on the evening breeze. "You don't have to settle for Eleanor," she said, her hand brushing his sleeve. "She's steady, but she's not what a man like you needs." Gideon's jaw tightened, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "I know what I need, Miss Lillian," he said, his tone firm but not unkind. "I've chosen Eleanor," passing by. The open window with a tray of dishes heard every word. She didn't pause, didn't falter, but a spark flared in her chest, not jealousy, not triumph, but something fiercer. She set the tray down and stepped outside, her boots soft on the porch boards. "Evening, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. He turned, and for the first time his gaze softened as if seeing her anew. The following morning, Gideon joined Eleanor as she checked the irrigation ditches along the eastern fields. He walked beside her, his hands in his pockets, the silence between them comfortable but charged. "You know this land better than anyone?" he said, watching her adjust a wooden sluice. "Better than I ever will." Eleanor wiped her hands on her apron, meeting his eyes. "It's not about knowing it," she said. "It's about listening to it." He tilted his head, studying her, and for a moment the distance between them seemed to shrink. Then, from the ridge above, a rider appeared, a stranger in a dark coat, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. Gideon stiffened, his hand dropping to his side as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Eleanor noticed, her pulse quickening. "Someone you know?" she asked, her voice low. Gideon didn't answer, but his eyes darkened with a secret he couldn't hide. "Who is he? And what does he want with Gideon?" The stranger's silhouette lingered on the ridge above Sagebrush Hollow Ranch, his dark coat a stark contrast against the fading light. Eleanor Langley's question, "Someone you know?" hung unanswered as Gideon Caldwell's gaze hardened, his hand still hovering where a revolver might have been in another life. He shook his head, his voice low. "No one worth mentioning," he said, but the tightness in his jaw told Eleanor otherwise. She didn't press, turning back to the irrigation ditch, her hand steady despite the unease curling in her chest. The rider vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving only hoofprints in the dust and a shadow over Gideon's silence. As they walked back to the ranch house, the Montana sky burned crimson, and Eleanor felt the weight of something unspoken trailing them like a storm on the horizon over the next week. Gideon's visits grew more frequent, his black gelding a fixture. In the corral, he threw himself into the ranch's work mending a broken gate, hauling timber for a new fence line, his city-bred hands learning the rhythm of the land. Eleanor noticed the way he watched her, not with the bold admiration men reserve for Lillian, but with a quiet intensity, as if piecing together a map only he could read. One afternoon, as she balanced the ranch's ledgers in the small office off the kitchen, Gideon leaned in the doorway, his hat tipped back. "You handle numbers." "Like a banker," he said, a note of respect in his voice. Eleanor glanced up, her pencil pausing mid-calculation. "Numbers don't lie," she replied, "unlike people." His brow lifted, but he didn't argue. Instead, he pulled up a chair, asking about the ranch's debts with a focus that surprised her. She answered plainly, detailing the loans from the bank in Helena and the drought that had thinned their herd. He listened, his dark eyes fixed on her, and when she finished, he said, "You're wasted on ledgers, Eleanor. You should be running this valley." Her scar caught the lamplight as she met his gaze, unsure if he was mocking her. But his expression held no jest, only a flicker of something warm, something dangerous. That evening, at supper, Lillian's charm was a blade, honed and deliberate. She sat across from Gideon, her dress a soft rose that glowed in the candlelight, and spoke of the town's harvest festival, her voice lilting like a song. "You'll dance with me there, won't you?" Mr. Caldwell? She asked, her smile daring him to say no. Gideon's reply was polite but distant. Not much for dancing, he said, his eyes drifting to Eleanor, who was quietly passing the potatoes. But I reckon Eleanor might know the steps better than she lets on. Lillian's laugh was sharp, like glass splintering. Eleanor? She'd rather dance with the horses. Beatrice frowned, but Eleanor only smiled faintly, her fork steady. Horses keep better time, she said, and Gideon's lips twitched. A rare crack in his guarded demeanor. The next morning, Eleanor found a small wooden box on the ledge where she kept her gardening tools. Inside was a single pressed fireweed flower, its vibrant pink preserved in wax, and a note in Gideon's precise hand, for the one who listens to the land. Her breath caught, not from sentiment but from the realization that he'd noticed her, truly noticed her, in ways she hadn't expected. She slipped the note into her journal, its pages now half filled with sketches of wildflowers and fragments of thoughts she'd never shared. Later, as she rode out to check the northern fence line, Gideon joined her, his horse matching her Mara's steady gait. They spoke of small things, the stubbornness of the wind, the cost of barbed wire, but the silence between them was softer now, like a conversation waiting to begin. When they paused by a creek, he dismounted and handed her a canteen, his fingers brushing hers. You don't ask for much, he said, almost to himself. Eleanor tilted her head, the scar on her cheek catching the sunlight. I ask for what matters, she replied, and for the first time he looked away, as if her words had struck too close, but Lillian wasn't one to yield. That evening, as the ranch house glowed with lamplight, she found Gideon in the barn, brushing down his gelding. Her voice was low, honeyed with intent. You're making a mistake, Gideon, she said, stepping closer, her hand grazing his arm. Eleanor's steady, but she's not enough for a man like you. You need someone who shines. Gideon stepped back, his eyes cold. I don't need shine, Miss Lillian. I need truth. Eleanor, fetching a bucket from the barn's corner, overheard every word. Her heart thudded, not with pride, but with a fierce clarity. She was more than a choice. She was a challenge he hadn't expected. She stepped into the light, her voice calm but firm. The horses need water, Lillian. Best not keep them waiting. Lillian's smile froze and she swept out, leaving a charged silence in her wake. The next day, as Eleanor tended the wildflowers, a letter arrived at the ranch, sealed with red wax and addressed to Gideon. He opened it in the parlor, his face unreadable, but Eleanor noticed the way his hands tightened on the paper. When Beatrice asked who it was from, he said only, "Business from New York," and tucked it away. But later, as Eleanor passed the stable, she saw him reading it again, his expression a mix of resolve and dread. That night, under a sky thick with stars, she found him alone by the corral, the letter crumpled in his hand. Trouble? She asked, her voice soft but direct. He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The past has a way of finding you, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before she could ask more, hoofbeats echoed in the distance, the same. Dark rider, closer now, watching from the shadows. What does he know about Gideon? And why does it feel like a storm is coming? The hoofbeats of the dark rider faded into the night, but their echo lingered in Eleanor Langley's mind as she stood by the corral, watching Gideon Caldwell's silhouette against the star-strewn Montana sky. His words, "The past has a way of finding you," hung heavy, like smoke after a fire. Eleanor's hazel eyes traced the crumpled letter in his hand, its red wax seal glinting faintly in the moonlight. She wanted to ask more, to unravel the shadow that tightened his jaw, but something in his stance, rigid yet fragile, held her back. You should head inside, Gideon said, his voice low, not unkind but distant. Night's cold. Eleanor nodded, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, but as she turned toward the ranch house, she glanced back. He hadn't moved, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for the rider to return. Her chest tightened, not with fear, but with a fierce resolve to understand the man she'd agreed to marry. The next week brought a restless rhythm to Sagebrush Hollow Ranch. Gideon threw himself into the work with a fervor that bordered on desperation, repairing the windmill, reinforcing the barn roof, even riding out to negotiate with a cattle buyer from Bozeman. Eleanor matched his pace, her days filled with checking the hay stores and soothing a spooked colt, but her nights were spent with her journal, its pages now crowded with questions about Gideon's past. His visits were no longer just business. He sought her out, lingering by the wildflower beds or joining her to inspect the creek's flow. One afternoon, as they walked the southern pasture, a hawk circling above, he asked about her scar. "How'd it happen?" His voice was gentle, but his eyes held a curiosity that made her pause. Eleanor touched the pale line on her cheek, her fingers steady. "Fell from a hayloft when I was 9. Thought I could fly." She smiled faintly, expecting him to laugh, but Gideon's expression softened. "Brave kid," he said. "Most would have quit climbing." Her breath caught, not at the words, but at the way he saw her not as the scarred sister, but as someone who dared to reach for the sky. That evening, at the Harvest Festival in Sweetgrass Valley, the town square glowed with lanterns and fiddles sang beneath the stars. Lillian Langley was a vision in emerald silk, her laughter drawing a crowd of admirers. She pulled Gideon into a reel, her hand firm on his arm, but his eyes kept drifting to Eleanor, who stood by a bonfire, her simple gray dress catching the firelight. Beatrice nudged her daughter forward. "Go dance," she hissed. "Don't let Lillian steal him." Eleanor shook her head, content to watch. But when Gideon broke free and crossed the square, his boots kicking up dust, her heart stuttered. "Care to try those steps?" he asked, offering his hand. Her scar burned under the crowd's gaze, but she took his hand, her grip firm. They danced, not with flair, but with a quiet rhythm, their steps syncing like a conversation. "You're better than you claimed," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. Eleanor's lips curved. "I said horses keep better time, not that I couldn't dance." His laugh, rare and deep, sent a thrill through her, and for a moment the world was just them, moving beneath the Montana stars, but Lillian's eyes followed them, sharp as a hawk's. The next day at the ranch, she cornered Eleanor in the kitchen, her voice low and venomous. "You think you've won him with your dirt-stained hands and quiet ways?" she said, her chestnut curls trembling. "He'll tire of you, Eleanor. Men like him need fire, not embers." Eleanor met her sister's gaze, her voice calm but steel-edged. "Maybe he needs someone who doesn't burn everything she touches." Lillian's face flushed and she stormed out, leaving a chill in the air. That afternoon, Eleanor found a ribbon-tied bundle of sagebrush on her porch swing, its scent earthy and grounding. No, but she knew it was Gideon's doing, a quiet gesture like the pressed flower that spoke louder than words. The following morning, as Eleanor and Gideon rode out to check the cattle, a storm brewed on the horizon, gray clouds rolling in like a warning. They worked side by side, herding strays back to the main pasture, their silence comfortable but charged. When a calf bolted, Gideon spurred his horse after it, and Eleanor followed, her mare leaping a gully with ease. They cornered the calf, and as they caught their breath, Gideon looked at her, his eyes unguarded for the first time. "You ride like you were born to it," he said, a note of awe in his voice. Eleanor shrugged, but her cheeks warmed. "This land's in my blood." He nodded, and for a moment their hands brushed as they adjusted their reins, a spark passing between them, but the storm wasn't just in the sky. That evening, as rain lashed the ranch house, a knock sounded at the door. Beatrice opened it, to find the dark rider, his coat slick with water, his face half hidden by his hat. "I need to speak with Caldwell," he said, his voice rough like gravel under boots. Gideon stepped forward, his expression unreadable, but Eleanor saw the letter from New York tucked in his vest, its edges worn. "Not here," Gideon said, leading the man to the barn. Eleanor watched from the porch, rain soaking her shawl, her heart pounding. As the barn door closed, she caught a glimpse of the rider's face, hard, scarred, and hauntingly familiar to Gideon. Who is this man? And what truth is he bringing to Sagebrush Hollow? Rain battered the barn's tin roof as Eleanor Langley stood on the porch of Sagebrush Hollow Ranch, her shawl soaked through, her eyes fixed on the faint glow of a lantern inside. Gideon Caldwell and the scarred rider had vanished behind the barn door, their voices muffled by the storm. The glimpse of the rider's face hard, weathered, and somehow tied to Gideon gnawed at Eleanor's thoughts. She wanted to march across the muddy yard and demand answers, but the memory of Gideon's guarded eyes stopped her. He'd chosen her for her steadiness, not her curiosity, yet the letter from New York, its red wax seal now a symbol of secrets, felt like a wedge between them. As lightning cracked the Montana sky, Eleanor turned back to the house, her boots heavy with resolve. She wouldn't pry not yet, but she'd watch and she'd listen, the way she always had with the land. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the ranch glistening under a tentative sun. Gideon emerged from the guest quarters, his face drawn, the letter nowhere in sight. He joined Eleanor at the corral, where she was calming a skittish mare, his hands working the reins of his gelding with mechanical precision. "Everything settled?" she asked, her voice neutral but her hazel eyes searching. Gideon nodded too quickly. "Just business," he said, but the tightness in his voice betrayed him. They rode out to check the northern pasture, the air thick with unspoken questions. As they paused by a stand of cottonwoods, their leaves rustling like whispers, Gideon broke the silence. "You ever want to leave this place?" he asked, his gaze on the distant mountains. Eleanor adjusted her hat, surprised. "Thought about it once, as a girl, wanted to see the ocean. But this land's home," she glanced at him. "What about you? What keeps you running?" His jaw clenched, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then softly he said, "Some things you can't outrun." He spurred his horse forward, leaving her with the weight of his words and a flicker of something new. Trust, fragile but growing. Over the next few days, Gideon's presence at the ranch became a quiet constant. He helped Eleanor shore up the windmill's base, their shoulders brushing as they hauled stones, and joined her to repair a fence torn by the storm, their hammers falling in rhythm. One evening, as they sat on the porch mending harnesses, the sunset painting the valley gold, he asked about her journal. "You write in it often?" His voice was curious, almost shy. Eleanor's scar caught the light as she smiled faintly. "When the land speaks, I listen." She hesitated, then added, "It's where I keep what I can't say aloud." Gideon's eyes softened, and he reached into his vest, pulling out a small pencil carved with ivy. "Found this in town," he said, placing it in her hand, his fingers lingering. "For your thoughts?" Her heart stuttered, not with romance but with a warmth she hadn't known she craved. She tucked the pencil away, her fingers tracing its grooves, and that night, her journal gained a new entry, a sketch of cottonwoods, their branches reaching like hands, but Lillian Langley's fire burned hotter with each passing day. At supper, her laughter was a weapon aimed at Eleanor's quiet presence. "Gideon, you must find ranch life so dull," she said, her emerald eyes gleaming. "Eleanor's content with dirt and numbers, but surely you miss New York's sparkle." Gideon's fork paused, his voice even. "Sparkle fades. Strength lasts." Eleanor's lips twitched, but Lillian's smile hardened. Later, in the parlor, Lillian cornered Gideon, her voice low and urgent. "You're throwing away your future," she hissed, her hand on his sleeve. "Eleanor's a shadow. I could give you everything." Gideon stepped back, his eyes cold. "I don't want everything, Miss Lillian. I want enough." Eleanor, passing with a tray of tea, heard the exchange. Her pulse quickened, not with jealousy but with a fierce pride. She was enough, and Gideon saw it. She met his gaze as she set the tray down, and something passed between them. Unspoken but solid. The next morning, a crisis struck. A section of the creek had collapsed, flooding the eastern fields and threatening the hay crop. Eleanor and Gideon worked side by side, digging trenches to divert the water, their clothes caked with mud. As they rested by the creek, panting, Gideon watched her, his guard down. "You don't flinch at hard work," he said almost to himself. Eleanor wiped her brow, her scar glistening with sweat. "Hard work's honest," she replied. "Unlike secrets." His eyes darkened, but before he could speak, Beatrice called them back to the house. A second letter had arrived, its red wax seal identical to the first. Gideon's hand trembled as he took it, his face unreadable. "More business?" "Eleanor?" asked, her voice steady but probing. He didn't answer, tucking the letter away. That night, under a sky heavy with clouds, Eleanor found Gideon by the wildflower beds, the second letter open in his hands. His shoulders were slumped, a vulnerability she'd never seen. "You don't have to carry it alone," she said, stepping closer. He looked at her, his eyes raw. "Some burdens aren't meant to be shared," he said, but his voice cracked, and for the first time, he didn't turn away. They stood in silence, the wildflowers swaying between them, until a shout broke the night. From the barn, a lantern's glow flickered wildly, smoke curling into the sky. "Fire!" Beatrice's voice rang out. Eleanor and Gideon ran toward the barn, but in the chaos, Eleanor glimpsed the dark rider watching from the ridge, his scarred face illuminated by the flames. What has he done, and how deep do Gideon's secrets run? Smoke hung thick over Sagebrush Hollow Ranch, curling like ghosts from the barn's blackened beams. Eleanor Langley sprinted toward the inferno, her boots slipping in the mud, her heart pounding as flames licked the night sky. Gideon Caldwell was a step ahead, his coat flapping as he shouted orders to the ranch hands scrambling with buckets. "Get the horses out!" he roared, plunging into the smoke. Eleanor followed, her scarf pressed to her face, her eyes stinging as she untied panicked mares from their stalls. Together they led the animals to safety, their hands brushing in the chaos, a silent partnership forged in crisis. As the hands doused the flames with creek water, Eleanor glanced toward the ridge. The dark rider was gone, his scarred face etched in her memory, a specter tied to Gideon's secrets. The fire was contained by dawn, leaving the barn's western wall charred but standing, a testament to their fight. Gideon and Eleanor collapsed by the corral, soaked and exhausted, their breaths mingling in the cool air. "You didn't hesitate," he said, his voice rough with smoke and something deeper. Eleanor met his gaze, her scar shadowed by soot. "Neither did you," she replied, and for a moment the world was just them. Bound by survival. The next day the ranch buzzed with repair plans, but a heavier tension lingered. Beatrice Langley, pale and shaken, cornered Gideon in the parlor. "That fire wasn't an accident," she said, her voice trembling. "Who's after you, Caldwell?" Gideon's jaw tightened, but he shook his head. "No one you need to worry about," he said, his eyes flicking to Eleanor, who stood quietly by the door. She didn't speak, but her hazel eyes held a question he couldn't ignore. Later, as they walked the scorched barn, assessing the damage, Eleanor broke the silence. "That rider, he's no stranger to you, is he?" Gideon's hand paused on a charred beam, his shoulders stiff. "He's from a life I left behind," he said, his voice low. "That's all you need to know." Eleanor stepped closer, her voice firm. "I'm not just your partner, Gideon. I'm in this now. Tell me the truth." He looked at her, his dark eyes raw with conflict, but before he could speak, Lillian's voice cut through the air. She stood in the barn's doorway, her emerald dress stark against the ash, her face a mask of fury. "You've brought ruin to us, Gideon," she sighed, her voice venomous. "That fire could have taken everything. Choose me instead, someone who won't drag you into the dirt." Eleanor's chest tightened, but Gideon's response was swift, his voice cold as steel. "I chose Eleanor because she's real, Lillian. You're a flame that burns out." Lillian's eyes widened, her lips trembling, and she fled, leaving a silence that pulsed with truth. Eleanor didn't thank him, but her hand brushed his as they turned back to the barn, a gesture that said enough. Over the next few days, Gideon opened up, not in words but in actions. He joined Eleanor to replant the wildflower beds scorched by embers, their hands working side by side in the soil. One evening, as they sat by the creek, the water glinting under a crescent moon, he handed her a small tin box. Inside was a silver locket, plain but etched with a single columbine flower. "My mother's," he said, his voice soft. "She'd have liked you." Eleanor's fingers traced the locket, her throat tight. "Why me, Gideon?" she asked, her scar catching the moonlight. He looked at her, his guard down. "Because you see the world as it is, not as you want it to be. I need that, I need you." Her heart swelled, not with romance but with a quiet certainty. She was no longer just a choice, but a home, but the rider's shadow loomed. One morning, as Eleanor and Gideon rode out to check the repaired fences, a third letter arrived, its red wax seal now familiar. Gideon read it alone in the stable, his face ashen. Eleanor found him there, the letter trembling in his hand. "Enough hiding," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "Who is he?" Gideon's eyes met hers, haunted but resolute. "His name's Amos Kane," he said, the words heavy. "He was my brother-in-law. My wife, Clara, she died 3 years ago. Amos blames me, says I failed her. He's been hunting me ever since." Eleanor's breath caught, not at the revelation, but at the pain in his voice. She reached for his hand, her grip firm. "You're not alone anymore," she said, and for the first time he didn't pull away. That night, as they sat by the fire in the parlor, Gideon told her more how Clara's illness had broken him, how he'd fled New York to escape Amos's vengeance. Eleanor listened, her journal open, sketching a columbine as he spoke, her presence a balm to his wounds. Their fingers brushed as she closed the book, and he looked at her, not as a partner, but as something more. "I didn't expect you," he whispered, his voice raw. Eleanor's lips curved, her scar soft in the firelight. "Good things come unexpected," she said, and they sat closer, the distance between them gone, but as the fire crackled, a sound shattered the quiet glass breaking in the kitchen. Eleanor and Gideon leapt up, rushing to find a rock on the floor, wrapped in a note scrawled in jagged script. "You can't hide, Caldwell. I'm coming." Outside, hoofbeats thundered, fading into the night. Eleanor's hand tightened on Gideon's, her eyes blazing with defiance. What does Amos want, and can they face him together? The shattered glass in Sagebrush Hollow Ranch's kitchen gleamed like fallen stars. The rock in its scrawled threat, "You can't hide, Caldwell. I'm coming," a wound in the quiet night. Eleanor Langley's hand tightened on Gideon Caldwell's, her hazel eyes blazing with defiance as hoofbeats faded into the Montana darkness. "Amos Kane," Gideon said, his voice a low growl, the name heavy with years of guilt. "He won't stop until he faces me." Eleanor's scar caught the lamplight, her voice steady despite the fear clawing her chest. "Then we face him. Together." Gideon looked at her, his dark eyes softening. A man who'd run from his past now anchored by the woman who'd become his future. They stepped back into the house, the note burning in his hand, and as Beatrice Langley bolted the door, Eleanor knew the dawn would bring more than sunlight. It would bring reckoning. Morning broke over Sweetgrass Valley, the wildflowers along, the creek shimmering with dew, their resilience a mirror to Eleanor's resolve. She rose early, her journal heavy with sketches of columbines and words she'd written for Gideon, words she hadn't yet dared to speak. He found her by the corral, saddling her mare, his face etched with sleepless determination. "I'm riding out to meet Amos," he said, his hand on his gelding's reins. "This ends today." Eleanor's heart lurched, but her voice was firm. "Not alone, you're not." She mounted her horse, her scarf fluttering in the breeze, and Gideon's protest died in his throat. He nodded, a flicker of pride in his eyes, and they rode toward the northern ridge, where Amos's tracks had led the night before, the land holding its breath. They found him in a clearing, his scarred face hard under his wide-brimmed hat, his revolver glinting at his hip. Amos's eyes locked on Gideon, his voice bitter as ash. "You let Clara die, Caldwell. You don't deserve peace." Gideon dismounted, his hands raised, his voice steady. "I failed her, Amos. I've carried that every day. But this won't. Bring her back." Eleanor stayed mounted, her hand near the rifle in her saddle, her gaze flicking between the men. Amos's laugh was a jagged thing. "You think marrying some ranch girl erases it?" His eyes cut to Eleanor, dismissive, but she spoke, her voice clear as a bell. "He's not erasing anything. He's building something new. You could too." Amos faltered, his hand twitching, and in that moment Gideon stepped forward, his voice raw. "Let her go, Amos. Hate me, but let this end." The air stilled, the wildflowers swaying, and Amos's revolver lowered, his shoulders slumping. "You don't get to forget," he said, but the fight was gone. He mounted his horse and rode away, leaving dust and silence, a ghost finally fading. Back. At the ranch, the weight of Amos's departure settled like dust after a storm. Gideon and Eleanor stood by the wildflower beds, the charred barn a reminder of how close they'd come to losing everything. "You didn't have to stand with me," Gideon said, his voice thick. Eleanor's fingers brushed the locket at her throat, his mother's gift. "I didn't do it for you," she said, her lips curving. "I did it for us." He looked at her, his guard gone, and pulled her close, his arms a haven she hadn't known she needed. Their lips met, not with urgency, but with a quiet promise, the kind that grows from shared scars and stubborn hope. As they parted, Eleanor's scar glowed in the sunlight, no longer a mark of shame but a badge of survival. The days that followed wove a new rhythm into Sagebrush Hollow. Gideon and Eleanor worked as true partners, rebuilding the barn and planning a new irrigation system to secure the ranch's future. Beatrice, softened by their courage, began to see Eleanor not as a shadow, but as the ranch's heart. Lillian, her fire dimmed, left for Helena to visit cousins, her silence a reluctant acceptance of Eleanor's place. One evening, as the valley glowed under a harvest moon, Gideon led Eleanor to the creek, where the wildflowers bloomed fiercer than ever. He knelt, not with a ring, but with a vow. "I chose you once for peace," he said, his voice steady. "Now, I choose you for love. Marry me, Eleanor, not for the ranch, but for me." Her eyes shimmered, her journal tucked under her arm, its pages now a love letter to their journey. "I already said yes," she whispered, and they laughed. The sound carrying across the plains dot by spring, Sagebrush Hollow was transformed, not just the land, but the people. The ranch thrived, its wildflowers a symbol of resilience. And Eleanor was no longer the overlooked sister, but Mrs. Caldwell, the woman who tamed the haunted man's heart. The townsfolk of Sweetgrass Valley whispered her name with awe, not for beauty, but for strength, a story that echoed like the wind. As for the wildflowers, they held a secret rooted in history. The crow believed they bloomed where love endured, a lesson Eleanor and Gideon embodied. Their story reminds us that love isn't found in perfection, but in the quiet courage to choose each other, scars and all. If you've loved this journey, hit that like button and follow for more tales of the American West. There's always another story waiting in the wildflowers.